So now a lot of people say, what does that toolbox look like? Right? So if you click down, each of those stages, I have identified a tool that must exist in the leader's toolbox. Mm-hmm. When you talk about orientation, leaders here must be incredibly influential in their communication and fantastic storytelling. You know, now we're talking about storytelling, whether it's in training, whether it's in leadership, whether it's communicating vision. Leaders need to master these two things, influential communication and storytelling. And not only that, you need to sound like a broken record about your vision, about your goals, about the why. Because if you don't sound like a broken record, you're not communicating enough. So that's where I believe leaders, instead of focusing on just the output and the results, focus on how do I communicate the vision, how often, and how do I inspire people through storytelling.
Yeah. I came across I think on Instagram, an old video, which I love very much, of Steve Jobs. Now, I'm going to say this. Steve Jobs was a great person and a great leader in many ways, but he was a terrible person in others. So I'm not equating one with the other, but it was a great video because he was in one of those classical scenarios where he was on stage and an expert programmer calls him out. Okay, he was an open plenary and they asked for questions, and this guy and you could just tell by his demeanor that this guy was a senior expert on systems and programming, and he calls Steve Jobs out and he says, listen, I just want to point out you don't know what the hell you're talking about. Several of the things you've said so far are completely incorrect, okay? And he basically challenges him as a leader, and he says, what qualifies you to even decide anything in a company? What have you actually contributed? So, which I think a lot of staff members who are subject matter experts might ask upper management, what's upper management good for? And I have to give Steve Jobs credit. He gave the perfect leader's response. The first thing he did is he jokingly held up a chair like he was trying to fend off a lion. And then the next thing he said, he sat down on the chair and he said he thought about it, which I think is brilliant. I think that it's not your job to be fast to respond and then come out looking like a hero. I think it's about receiving the message, and he really received the message. And he wasn't insulting. He wasn't defensive. He says, you know what? He basically doubled down on what his role was. His role was not the programming aspect, but his role was to see the big picture. And he says, you know what, I profoundly respect my subject matter experts, but sometimes they don't see the big picture, and that's what my job is. They think that the concrete example is often programmers say, you know what, I'm in love with this programming element, let's develop it and then let's sell it to the customer. And he said, my job as a CEO is the conductor, right? I've got to ask myself the other question, what is it that a customer might need? And then I work backwards and see if I can't link it with things that we have. A little bit of a long story, but what I loved about the response was it was an example of leadership because he was open to the criticism. He was not defensive. He did not go on the counteroffensive and call a guy a bunch of names. He acknowledged what he had to say. He came back with legitimate counter where he explained his position and his role, okay? And it made sense. And it was, for me, an amazing example of often